We have learned a lot about the world and human nature in our experience of a global pandemic. COVID-19 has behaved like an enemy scout, infiltrating homes, nations, churches, and economies, spreading among us and revealing our biological vulnerabilities as well as our social and economic vulnerabilities. And the response has been decidedly mixed. Early on, the economic conversation was ironically encouraging. In the United States, early in the response, this was the first time in a long time that people, rather than the economy, were the central focus. Now, I know in the last few weeks that has changed. There's been a hasty push by some to reopen the economy. But in the beginning there, for the first time in a long time, there was an extended conversation about what it takes for poor people and the average person to live, survive, and make ends meet in our economy. And then on the other side, there has been some much needed conversation about God, faith, and the common good. And yet it seems as if that conversation has been hijacked by people who see the pandemic only as God's punishment for a disaster that has shut down houses of worship and shuttered the world economy, worsening inequality and tightening the chains of poverty. Our religious conversation has been long on getting back into our churches and very short on what does God's love and justice demand at a time of chaos and disorientation. The loudest voices in faith and religion can be heard talking about this pandemic as God's judgment, or how government shelter-at-home orders are a violation of freedom of religion. One would be hard-pressed to hear a reflection from those with large media platforms. Boy, I tell you, they have large platforms. But you'll be hard-pressed to hear a reflection from them on God's character as a loving, liberating presence in the midst of pain, suffering, and oppression. And I'm afraid there are far more examples of Pharaoh of Egypt. You know what I mean? That in the face of misery and suffering, there has been a hardening of the heart of people who we expect to demonstrate love and justice. Where is that witness to God? Love, justice, neighborliness. Well, the Exodus text I read give us a different picture of God. This is God, not as absent or distant. This is God, not in league with empire, not propping up the political and economic status quo. This is God revealing that God is present, that God is aware, and that God responds to suffering. And in Exodus, we get to see what is important to God when the people are oppressed. The Israelites are being ground under the oppression of slavery. They have been crying out for God to do something about their condition, but the persistence of their bondage and oppression makes them wonder if God has forgotten God's covenant with their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so when Moses encounters God's presence in a flame of fire out of a bush that was not consumed, God disabuses us of any notion that God is absent or unaware of what is going on. And the words are definitive and providential. If you ever forget them, just keep it. It sweeps and reads so easily. God tells Moses, I have observed the misery. I have heard their cry. I know their suffering. I see, I hear, and I know. That's God's message. I see, I hear, and I know. And that's just the beginning. God's presence and God's awareness lead to action. God is going to do something. God seeing, hearing, and knowing about oppression is the tip-off for us right away that God is going to respond. And so God lays out the plan, and boy, it is elegant in its simplicity. It won't be easy, but it is elegant in its simplicity. I have come to deliver them. I am going to bring them up out of the place that they're in and carry them to a good and broad land. In the middle of oppression, God's presence and awareness mean God's plan is what? Deliverance. God's plan is deliverance. And the destination for those who suffer remains the same. A good and broad land. Now, I want to be clear about something. This is why I was hesitant to read the Exodus story. The Exodus story is not our story. I know how much we love this story, how much we like to appropriate it, to appropriate this Israelite experience as our own. The liberation paradigm here has always been attractive, even attractive to us wealthy, privileged folk in the 21st century of the United States of America who do not know the depths of political and economic bondage that the people of Israel experienced. And so perhaps what I want us to do is we need to pause and realize, especially when we read about what looks like the displacement of people called the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, that not everyone in Exodus gets liberated. Not everyone gets liberated. So I hope we take a step back before we assume that we are the ones who always need liberation and reflect on whether we are the people from whom vulnerable people need to be liberated. I'm talking to you, church, with people with big platforms. No, I hope rather that we focus on the action and character of God. I hope we let God seeing, hearing, and knowing about the people's misery and oppression prompt us with a new word about God's presence during a pandemic. I want church folk to take the lead on the conversation about God's view of love and justice when things are falling apart. I hope we take a critical look at how God might view us. Yes, even us, in light of the poverty, inequality, and oppression that prevailed before the spread of COVID-19. And that is now being exacerbated because previously we did not want to see, hear, and know how bad it was. And how bad it has been for far too many of God's people. I hope that we do not confuse our ideology with theology such that, like Pharaoh, our hearts become hardened when the most vulnerable cry out to us for help, especially when we get a handle on this disease. Because just as God sees, hears, and knows the suffering and oppression of the Israelite, God also sees, hears, and knows the indifference and the complicity of the Egyptians in the exploitation and subjugation of the people. Yes, I'm preaching now. I'm inviting us to trust God again so that our witness to God would be a witness that says God is going to deliver. I'm inviting us to trust God. Trust a God who declared that I have seen, I have heard, and I know what misery and suffering looks like. That when we are afraid, when we are full of doubt, when we have exhausted all of our emotional resources, that we do not turn on our neighbors or turn our backs on our neighbors. What would it look like? What would it look like if we embrace and bear witness to deliverance in ways that also breaks the cycle of suffering and oppression, especially when we get a handle on this pandemic? How do we let our faith that God sees, hears, and knows inspire us to a broader, more expansive vision of God's love and justice, not just what is good for us, not just because of what we need, but as a promise of a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey for all God's children. Oh, we have an opportunity right now. Whether we are the ones undergoing misery and oppression, or the ones who are enjoying the privileges of an unequal society and economy, or both, wherever we land, this is an opportunity for us to bear witness to a God who is aware and present with us all. We have an opportunity to join God in living out what God's love and justice demands when all of us are at risk. We have an opportunity to reject the attempts to spiritualize this pandemic and call attention to the political and economic bondage that makes some of us more susceptible to this disease than others. We have a chance. And if we, the people of God, show up with an appeal and a demand for love and justice, then we can testify to a God whose presence and awareness mean deliverance. That's God's plan. That's God's plan. And the destination remains the same for all God's children, no matter who we are. Bringing us up out of this place and carrying us to a good and broad land flowing with milk and honey. May it be so. Amen.